Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writer's Lunch. This week we have Shannon Winton, who's going to be talking about poisons for writers, specifically for writers, because we all have dangerous search histories. And then next week, a little preview for next week, Ian will be talking about video games. Ian, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I'm going to be talking about writing in video games, both in terms of, what are some great games with great writing, how games get written. And yeah, I mean, those are pretty much the two prongs of my attack. So I don't have a third one to round out the trilogy. So there we go. But yeah, video games and writing.
We're going to get Ian's event up shortly, but if you would like to follow us on Facebook at Houston Authors, the event will show up there. And I have accidentally sent to the waiting room that nobody is in how to follow us on Eventbrite. So you can go to either of those places and sign up. Give me an hour and a half for Ian's event next week, and we will get better at posting the events further in advance.
August was a lot. August was a lot.
It's so hot. Nothing happened.
Yeah.
So I'm Shannon Winton, and I am going to remove the waiting room and start presenting and talk to you guys about poisons. Yay! So authors, pick your poisons. Before we go too far into this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and also ask that my co-hosts let me know if there are questions, because on my computer, I do not see the chat when I'm hosting. Excuse me. So about me, I am the lead editor at iTunes Editing, one of the founders of Houston Independent Authors, which runs Writer's Lunch. I was Houston Municipal Liaison for NaNoWriMo for more than 2 years, but I don't remember the years that I was there. I love authors. We're great. I am a current co-coordinator of the Houston chapter of the Editorial Freelancers Association. If you do not know what that is okay, but it is a giant organization that is nationwide, although we do have members outside of the US. And it's basically a repository of editors. It's a place where we get education, where we find other editors to talk to hang out with, to commiserate with, and a place that has a wonderful directory for you, authors, to find editors that work in your specific realm. I'm also the co-founder of the Tomeworks Editing Collective, and important for this particular one, I am a registered nurse. And I'm a registered nurse who has the great honor of accidentally poisoning herself before. I'm going to tell you that little story because it's kind of interesting, but also shows you how easy poisonings occur. When I had my second kid, I was on blood pressure medicines for my preeclampsia and, went on for a few months after the baby was born. That's not unusual. My physician said, hey, your blood pressure is still a little bit high. How about we double the dose you're on, keep taking the same pills that you're already on, and see if it helps. I called her back and I was like, hey, it's still high, 40s, 150. She's like, okay, take 3 pills a day. Let's do that for a week, see how it works. And I said, all right, it's fine. And she's like, all right, well, we're going to triple your dose just to get you over this hump while your hormones re-regulate, while you're like not sleeping. And I was like, okay, cool. I had a very bad night with my daughter and did not sleep very well. And I asked my husband to just go get my meds because I normally take in the morning, because I was like, I just got to pass out. What I forgot from my sleeplessness is that I had run out of the original dose. And so the ones that I'd asked him to get me were the triple doses, triple what I had been on. And I took 3 of them, which means from the original dose that I had, I gave myself 9 times what, my original dose had been. Luckily, I was fine, except I felt very stupid. I had heart palpitations. I had symptoms throughout the day. My doctor was like, do you want to come in? What do you do? And I was like, I want to call my mommy, because when you're miserable, you do. But also my mother is a cardiac ICU nurse. So it really helps to have somebody who's qualified to come check on you. And so when she got there, she rolled her eyes at me and she was like, well, that was silly. I'm going to hang out with my granddaughter and check your blood pressure every hour until this wears off. And I was like, okay, cool. And everything turned out fine. However, that shows you just how easily someone who is knowledgeable about this stuff in extreme circumstances can do this, let alone somebody who maybe isn't knowledgeable about this or who has nefarious intent and poison somebody. So we're going to talk about poisons because there's a lot of ways poisons show up in our writing and a lot of ways that you can use poisons in your writing as well. So what is a poison? I love this meme. If it bites you, if you bite it and you die, it's poisonous. If it bites you and you die, it's venomous. If it bites me and it dies, that means I'm poisonous. And if it bites itself and I die, it's voodoo. But a simpler means is substance that through a chemical action kills, injures, or impairs an organism. So that's a really broad definition of what a poison can be, which is good because a poison can essentially be anything. And that's something that you should be aware of when you're thinking about what poisons to use inside of your stories. One of the cool things that the CDC does is they have a lot of information on different kinds of poisons and toxins out there. Unintentional poisons, the most common unintentional poisons, like when I poisoned myself, was an accidental misuse of drugs. That accounts for the majority of the poisons, toxic or not, well, deadly or not, that occur in America. So more than likely, if you're going to use poisons and you're trying to be realistic in your story, it'll be an accidental overdose. It'll be, I grabbed the wrong medicine. It'll be the medicine maybe wasn't labeled correctly at the pharmacy and something bad happened. The next most common thing that happens, something like 600 or 700, I wish I had actually printed this out. People still die of carbon monoxide poisoning every year in America. And that's really easy to track and follow and like actually evaluate. And most of the time that happens because of a failure inside of a gas line. And then the next most common is pesticide poisonings. And granted, most of the time this is kids who get into pesticides in one form or fashion. Either they are able to get underneath the sink or wherever the poisons are kept in their house, or somebody has baits and traps around that they can access inside or outside. And one of the fun things to look at, fun or not, is the different pesticide classes, because even if you don't have access to things that were common poisons historically, like arsenic and thallium, and we'll get into those later, you can pretty easily get a hold of a lot of these pesticides that are still deadly, that many of which are easy to accidentally ingest in one form or fashion or purposefully put into other people's food. And it can even, this nice little graph here, again, from the CDC, shows you what you might find for the legitimate use of that poison, what happens if somebody is acutely exposed to it, how it impacts them negatively, and the name. So some of the fun things that they tell you is how people can make this stuff on their own. For instance, this last one down here, the parathiums, this is in flea medicine. A lot of your powdered flea medicines have it, but you can crush up chrysanthemums and actually extract it. But most of our poisons, most of the ones that we know about, actually do come from plants in some form or fashion, although manufactured poisons and things that do not exist in nature are more and more common, especially in like war and espionage now than they used to be. I'm not going to go too far into those, but I think it is important to know that your plants can kill you. Like daffodils, they look so cute. They can murder you. At-risk poisons in real life that are most likely to be poisoned intentionally or not are the terminally ill. Most of the time, I presume this is actually mercy killings, but I could not find actual documentation of that. Or this is an overdose of pain medicines, I presume. The terminally ill tend to take more medications because of pain and then chronic diseases that are getting worse and worse towards the end of life. The very young and very old oftentimes have accidental exposures to toxins. Again, kids getting into things that they shouldn't get into. And then the elderly often have a harder time reading and giving themselves their own medicine. However, Munchausen syndrome by proxy exists. It is not as common as it tends to be represented in fiction, but it is a real thing. From my understanding, about 1% of complaints by parents are usually considered Munchausen syndrome by proxy. But
hey, Shannon, what's Munchausen's by proxy?
Oh, apologies. Okay, so what this means, so Munchausen syndrome is when you harm yourself to get attention. By proxy is when you harm somebody else to get attention. And it's not always fatal. Sometimes it can just be a hypochondriac kind of response where you're taking yourself or your kid into the doctor to get more attention. Normally, it's not diagnosed unless you do cause harm, but not necessarily death. So because there's not a great way to evaluate this and track this, the estimation that I've seen is that about 5% of people who do have Munchausen syndrome by proxy will cause the death of whoever their victim is. But the number of people who actually have Munchausen syndrome by proxy is incredibly low. Okay, other at-risk populations, drug addicts. You're a drug addict, you get a drug, the drug is laced with something that it shouldn't be, boom, you're dead. Or you just take way too much of what you should have had in the first place and you overdose. People who are mentally incapacitated or intellectually disabled are also at high risk, are a high risk population because they are dependent on other people to take care of them. Sometimes those people do a good job, sometimes they do not. Industrial workers and others in occupations with direct contact to toxic chemicals have environmental exposures that put them at much higher risk for being impacted by the chemicals that they are around. And then unwanted family members. This is a broad category, but intentional poisonings occur quite often. But it's the same as any sort of homicide. It's probably the husband or it's probably the wife. If for whatever reason you don't want to be in that relationship anymore and you can't see another out, poison. There is a myth of the poisoning woman, that this is something that mostly women do, that the majority of poisons are performed by women. In actuality, like most homicides, men lead the way. There's not really a true psychological profile of a poisoner. It's not like narcissistic personality disorder where you can look at childhood trauma or risk factors that occur throughout a person's life. In 2004, the FBI did a study of who becomes a poisoner, and they could not find any consistent hallmark traits. The homicide trends review from 1980 to 2008 show that statistically, poison killers are 60% men and about 40% female. Depending on the victim, when a woman is the victim, I couldn't find the actual number, but everything I saw was vast majority of the time, it's a man killing the woman. When the men are the victims, there's more of an equal split. It is estimated that only 1 out of every 30 to 40 poisons is accurately diagnosed. And even if they know that there was a poison involved, 20% of poisonings that are confirmed or verified are never solved. Fun stuff. All right, so when people are caught, which is very different than, say, the general population that is not caught, you see a lot of normal homicide motivations for poisoners that you would for anything else. They want more money. The person dies, you get your insurance payout, you get whatever was inside their bank account, whatever. They want the money. They're jealous. The person has been cheating on them and they are mad. So they poison them out of jealousy. If they are kind of a sociopath and they want something and they see the people as an obstacle in their way, they will get rid of those people, i.e., he would marry me if I wasn't taking care of these kids. If I get rid of the kids, I can get with that man. Revenge, same thing, love triangle, or somebody at work has pissed you off. There is a poisoner from Britain from the 70s named Graham Young who would just poison people for the shits and giggles of it. And he would poison a specific coworker when she made him mad. Revenge. He made me mad. Sadism. They like to see people suffer. There are poisoners that do things for religious conviction. If you think about the mass poisonings that occurred with cults, that is usually a religious conviction, and they will use poisons to get closer to their deity. There's also political conviction in a lot of situations where you have political rivals and somebody is murdered in order to keep them out of power. Either it's assassination by gunshot or it's poison. Poison is usually easier. And then people who, again, are sociopathic, there is boredom. More often than not, the people who get caught have a large ego. They think they are smarter, better than the people that they have poisoned, that the people who they are going after are less human than them or their lives are less valid. And going back to sort of the Munchausen syndrome, positive attention as a caregiver is apparently a very big one. Not necessarily just with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but in other caregiver roles. So women are not the only people who poison, but caregivers are huge when it comes to the poisoning world. If you are a female mass murderer, which happens, it does happen, 39% of them work in healthcare. So if you're looking at somebody to take care of you, if you're in the hospital and you get the wrong nurse, sorry, bud. Not all nurses that kill are female. There's male nurses as well. This was back in, I think, the 90s. Naz Hogel, who was German, killed upwards of 90 patients with something called acetylcholine, which is a paralytic. Danielle Paglia, I will mispronounce it, sorry, is an Italian nurse. She would give her patients deadly levels of laxatives and then take selfies with them, among other things. That was the only way she killed them, but she killed possibly up to 90 patients. She got caught in 2014. That was less than 10 years ago. Charles Cullen, this was closer to the 50s, used lethal injection of upwards of 40 patients. This one is interesting to me because it is local, and I did not know that this happened until I worked at the same hospital that this person did. But Janine Jones was an LVN back in the 1970s, and she killed upwards of 60 children in and around San Antonio with digitalis and a number of other medicines. She worked at the university hospital that I worked in the pediatric ICU, and I did train in that pediatric ICU. I usually worked in the adult trauma ICU. I was not cool with kids, but this woman murdered so many kids around San Antonio. She got caught when she was working for a pediatrician in Kerrville, and I had no idea for years and years. So it's interesting because we have a lot of male serial killers that have, numbers in the teens and 20s, and we know them by name. But there are a number of caregiver serial killers that you may have never heard of, and their kill count is way higher. Don't ignore other medical professionals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, anesthesiologists, unit or nursing aides, respiratory therapists, anybody who has access to medications and is in a caregiver role where they are not being supervised by anybody for long periods of times with patients has a means, not necessarily a motivation, but it makes itself easier when they put themselves in that position. So I'm not saying everybody is bad. I'm saying people who are poisoners or who have a pathological interest in poisoning others or killing others may gravitate to these fields because of the power and opportunity that it provides them. Okay, so we're going to go over the most common intentional poisons throughout history, because you may be writing a historical story. You may be writing something from the 50s or the 70s or the 1900s or the 1700s. I don't know. But these are things that you might want to know about common poisons. And I'm not saying you should necessarily use these as your poisons, because some of them have been used to death. But there are things that you should know about them because they are your guides, your relevant ones. So arsenic has been called the king of poisons. It can be reliably tested for now, and I believe they started being able to reliably test for it in the 1700s in certain parts of Europe, but it wasn't consistently able to be tested for until the 1950s. The issue is with arsenic is that it is endemic into most areas of the world for one reason or another, whether it's industrial or it just exists in the ground. It is a naturally occurring substance. And so it's an easily testable body and tissue fluid, but you can't necessarily prove that it was poison even if somebody has a high amount of it because of the low-level background exposure or the accidental ingestion that occurs if there's a lot of arsenic in your environment. So for instance, embalming fluid had arsenic in it until 1910. So a lot of the graveyards that are like in historical sites, I mean, if you're looking at the graveyards, say in New Orleans downtown, or if you're looking at graveyards that are from earlier parts of American history, if you're looking at the graveyards over in France in the catacombs, those things are swimming in arsenic. And if you unfortunately live close by to one of them and you have well water or groundwater, it's quite possible you are receiving low levels of arsenic in your drinking water if you have not tested it. And so there are sections of the country where you can't drink the local water because it is it's not filled with arsenic, but there is enough arsenic that it's a risk to you because arsenic over long periods of time causes cancer. So in conclusion, there's situations where you can have arsenic in your bodies in high levels and it not be poisoning. So then it becomes more difficult in those circumstances for somebody to prove that they were actually poisoned. When you are acutely poisoned with arsenic, symptoms include abdominal pain, diarrhea, bloating, muscle cramps, numbness. You know what else causes this? Pretty much everything. I mean, if you
periods.
What's that?
Your period.
Your period. Your period. You get the flu. That could be it. You got COVID. That could be it. There's all sorts of things that arsenic looks like. But again, it can be reliably tested for. More than likely, though, it will not be tested for unless there is a reason to believe that this person has been exposed to arsenic. And we'll go into that a little bit more. Cyanide. A lot of the other poisons, they kill slowly. It takes a day or two. Cyanide, depending on the dose, can kill you immediately, like within an hour or two. Most of the time when you see the movies where somebody like chews on a cyanide pill and they die immediately, that's not exactly how it works. It is painful and I would consider it protracted, but it doesn't go over weeks if you have a high enough dose. You can die within a few hours. It's hard to mask it as a natural death if you give a fatal dose because, again, it happens so quickly. It is extremely painful, extremely painful. Only about 40% of people actually can smell cyanide. And that's one of those things that's kind of cool. It just has to do with your nasal receptors. Like we all get asparagus tea, but only some people can smell it. So the bitter almond smell may not necessarily be the giveaway that you think it is, that's been used in, a number of different mystery novels, because not everybody can smell it. One of the interesting things that happens is people think, oh, it's not something that people can taste or whatever. Well, if you put it into an acid, it becomes really bitter. And depending on what acid it is, it may change color. So there are a number of men who were trying to poison their wives by putting it in their coffee, who were caught because the coffee turned green. It tasted funky. And the wives are like, I'm not drinking that. It is often, if you are going to give it because it has an underlying bitter taste, it is more than likely going to be masked by large amounts of sugar. And one of the interesting things that happens for people who have cyanide poison is their blood becomes extremely red. Well, you think cyan, that it would become blue, but no, it works by inhibiting a neurological process in the acetylcholine pathways, which I don't want to get too far into. But the other thing that it does is it makes it very hard for chemical reasons for your red blood cells to release oxygen. So it causes you to suffocate because your red blood cells are covered in oxygen, but they cannot release the oxygen to get to your cells. But that means that your blood becomes even more red than usual. Anna, you have a question?
Just a comment. Sean said in the chat, apples. And yes, apple seeds do have cyanide in them, but the amounts are so small that you'd have to eat it. Like, it's almost impossible to eat the number of apples you'd have to eat in one sitting, and to actually eat the seeds to kill yourself via cyanide poisoning by apple seed, because the amounts in the seeds are very trace.
So this is another one where the symptoms are kind of vague, unless you are looking at the autopsy and you're like, damn, this blood is red. That's redder than normal red.
So Johnny Appleseed was a serial killer, first one in history.
He wasn't trying to help us. He was just trying to end it on for himself. Symptoms include confusion and headache, heart palpitations and abnormal rhythms, abnormal breathing, low blood pressure. Aside from the low blood pressure, this can look like an anxiety attack, but some people do have low blood pressure when they have anxiety as well. So there's other things that this could look like that isn't necessarily cyanide, especially for long, slow cyanide poisoning. But when somebody dies, a lot of times they're confused, they just hurt all over, they can't breathe correctly, and then they suffocate internally. So their brain stops working. So that's not fun. But again, symptomology, it is painful. Thallium. Thallium is not something that you can easily find anymore, at least not in America. It was halted for production, I should say, in 1984. It is very regulated. There are only 6 manufacturers that can produce this in America today for very specific reasons. Poisonings with thallium are still more common in other parts of the world. For instance, this was one of Saddam Hussein's favorites because he could administer it or have somebody administer it while the person was in the country, and then they would not get sick until days or weeks later when they were somewhere else completely. One of the things that it has been called is the poison of poisons because it is truly odorless, it is truly tasteless. One of the telltale signs of it is hair loss, and that is not something that occurs very often with any other poisons. So if you see hair loss inside of a mystery book, sorry, I'm ruining it for you, it's probably thallium, especially if it's a historical mystery. It was used for a lot of industrial purposes and also in poisonings and pesticides for many, many years. But the risks associated with thallium are just so high that it was eventually just sort of shut down and replaced with other things. It causes gastrointestinal distress, convulsions, coma, and seizures. I've never seen anybody die of thallium poisoning. From my understanding is that people will die with their eyes open, their tongue hanging out mid-convulsion because they are so violent. It is a miserable death. Strychnine. And then I see that there are a lot of comments in the chat comments, but I don't know what they are. So Anna and Daphne, if you guys see anything that you're like, hey, go ahead and go back to this, just let me know.
No, it's not really any question. There's a lot of commentary.
Cool. I just want to make sure that I'm not leaving anybody behind. Strychnine, it is very common in rat poison historically, but it can also still be found in street dogs because it is mixed essentially with stuff. It is still used in outdoor poisons. So there are poisons that are rated for indoor use and outdoor use for pest control. It is only rated for outdoor use, which means you can still access it. It's difficult to administer though because it is super bitter and it is hard to mask it. Except you can actually find ways of turning strychnine into an inhalant. You can vaporize it and kill somebody that way. really hard. Really hard to do it without harming yourself. This is one that is also miserable. I mean, nobody enjoys dying of poisoning. It is neurological. A lot of the early symptoms are neurological: agitation, fear, stress, essentially like you are anxious, you are scared that you are dying, your body knows something is wrong. You do also have muscle spasms that continue to get worse and worse until they die. One of the telltale signs of this is that urine is dark. It causes urine to become like a tea or cola color. And then it also causes respiratory collapse. And that's usually when people die. I'm going to mispronounce this. I don't know why I can't pronounce this one. Conatine. And Anna, let me know if I got that right. But it is made, this is one of those where it's easy to get. And it's crazy. It's made from the common monkshood plant, and it is one of the most toxic alkaloids. These plants are usually found at higher elevations and then also in northern climates. But it is so poisonous that if a kid goes out and plays in the dirt and they start touching the roots of one of these without realizing it, it can kill them. Less than 2 milligrams is needed to kill. Anna's shaking her head. Am I getting something wrong?
No, I was shaking my head in despair. Like, oh my God.
Less than 2 milligrams is needed to kill an adult, and it mimics a heart attack and is difficult to test for because the dose required to be fatal is so low. The symptoms, again, are heart attack symptoms: cold, clammy skin, rapid pulse, nausea, numbness, or pain in the extremities. So this is hard to produce, but easy to use. And I hope if you live in a northern cold climate that the persons that you piss off don't know how to make it. Atropine and belladonna, the symptoms originally can make somebody appear drunk because their pupils dilate, they end up staggering around, they have belligerence, confusion, blurred vision, they might start puking on you. And so it is easy for people to confuse this person for a drug addict or a drunk and not provide them care, even though that's what they really need is to go to the hospital. One of the interesting things that can happen is it can be used as eye drop. And there are ways of actually getting atropine for legitimate medical uses and then distilling it into eye drops. And this has been a way that people have murdered before. It is pretty easy to test for if you know that you need to test for it. But because, again, it looks like somebody got drunk and then maybe died, it may not necessarily be tested for. Antimony is not very common these days, but it was very common in antiquity. It is a heavy metal, and a lot of heavy metal poisons actually look like arsenic in the symptomology, which is basically vague. I feel sick. I feel like I'm going to throw up and I have diarrhea and I don't feel good. It's used still in medicinal industrial products like batteries, bullets, fireproofing, durable medical equipment in different ways. And then because it is so much like arsenic, a lot of times it does get confused for arsenic. One of the things that distinguishes it is in some victims, it'll create a blistering or itchy red rash that can be, indicative of antimony. However, even though those are the most common ones that we've seen and know about and that have been studied, anything can be a poison. Too much of anything can kill you. You can drink too much water and die. If somebody puts you on 100% oxygen and you are not breathing regular room air, it can kill you. If you have too many old potatoes, it can kill you. Poisoning is often a crime of convenience. If you are the caregiver of somebody and you don't want them around, you can easily give them tainted food. You can give them drugs that they already have. Yes, Anna?
I was just going to say, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was just going to say, you remember when the cinnamon challenge was going around on social media?
Too much cinnamon.
People were worried about toxicity from the cinnamon.
Not just that. There was like a water challenge, right? Where most recently, a woman got super dehydrated out on a boat and drank a ton of water all at once and died because she had drank so much water. But there was like a challenge years ago. It was like for an NSYNC concert tickets or something like that, where they had them drink like just insane amounts of water, and a bunch of people went to the hospital.
Yeah. And so the reasons why this happened may seem really confusing because you're like, how can you have too much water? Well, a lot of times, depending on what it is that you're getting, there is a chemical change in your body. Too much water means that you don't have enough salts to balance out. And long story short, what that causes is brain swelling. So if you hyperdilute your blood and your own body fluids, it can cause you to eventually have seizures and die. If you have too much oxygen, the same thing that I kind of talked about with that other poisoning, your body needs to have a specific level of oxygen in the air unless you are currently having a hard time breathing, so that you can have an appropriate exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. If there's too much oxygen, it makes that exchange of carbon dioxide too difficult for your body, and you can eventually suffocate, even though your blood is filled with oxygen. And then again, anything, cinnamon, which you're talking about, is also a blood thinner in really large amounts, among other things. So you can cause yourself to hemorrhage if you somehow manage to eat enough cinnamon. So even though it seems like, well, this is stuff we have everywhere. That's the point. Anything can be a poison. Poisons can also, I said, be a crime of convenience or accident. There's a lot of drugs that interact badly together. There is more and more focus on this in the medical community. There are basically computer programs built into the pharmacy systems, both at your hospital and at your pharmacy, that say, hey, there's a possible drug interaction or a probable drug interaction, and they will not prescribe you medicines because it won't let you. Whereas historically, before that happened, physicians, especially if they were different physicians who weren't talking to each other, you had your specialist, they may prescribe you a medicine that will interact with your other medicines, and then they can have a cumulative effect or they can just stop working. So there's drugs that don't work very well together. I don't want to go too far into that, but there's also foods. Well, I'll go into one. St. John's wort is bad with almost everything. So it's really important to tell your doctors if you're taking minerals or vitamins, because sometimes those can interact poorly with your medicines.
And
grapefruit.
You will see, well, yeah, grapefruit really will fuck you up, but St. John's wort is, watch out for that guy, because he is, and when you look in like naturalist circles, they'll be like, oh, it's a natural cure for anxiety and whatever. But like, don't do that. Don't do it. Also, fun fact, activated charcoal will turn off a lot of meds. Do not take activated,
including birth control, by the way.
Including birth control, including antidepressants, including just a lot of stuff. So when you see those like really trendy foods that are super dark black, it's always activated charcoal. Don't do it just for the aesthetic.
Don't do it. Because it absorbs charcoal is actually used as like to help. When you are poisoned, they'll give you charcoal to try to absorb the poison out of your body. And so that's literally, when you're eating things with activated charcoal, that's literally what it's doing to your medications. It just like sucks them all up out of your body and lets you pass it, and then it's gone. Like, I've heard stories of people who got pregnant accidentally because of they had the trendy charcoal drink or whatever, and they didn't know that it messed with their birth.
Totally like stops your other medicine from working. Yeah. Daphne, she talked about grapefruit. Well, St. John's wort, that's what I talk, because it deactivates a lot of stuff, and then it can also mess with your blood pressure medicines and screw up how they impact your body. But foods that have incredibly high potassium can be really bad with blood thinners. The hypertensive medicines you take, and then grapefruit juice and certain other citrus foods can impact those medicines. So if you don't want to have a problem, then you avoid these things. But if you want to create problems for your fictitious characters, maybe.
I accidentally semi-poisoned myself with grapefruit one time.
Oh no!
I was on a medication this was before I had my thyroid removed. So I was on medication to control my Graves' disease, and I didn't know that it had an interaction with grapefruit. And then I drank like a grapefruit drink, and man, I felt so weird. I was like, it was like all of my symptoms from that my medication was like suppressing all came back all at once. And I felt so weird for like several hours that day. It was really bad. I didn't make that connection until later when I looked it up, and I was like, oh yeah, grapefruit interacts with my medication. Okay.
And you're on a low-level beta blocker for the Graves' disease at the time, right?
I was on a beta blocker and methimazole.
Yeah. So in conclusion, and I'm sorry that happened, I really am. They should have told you when they were giving you your medicines. There are ways that you can poison somebody with basically like, here's some citrus fruit, if they have the right conditions and are on the right medicines. So that is fun to know. One of the things that I see mixed up and messed up is what happens when there's an investigation or not an investigation into death. So a mortician, a medical examiner, and a coroner walk into a bar. These are not the same things. And it's probably going to shock and scare you to find out how different these things are and who has control in these situations. So a mortician is a person who has been trained and licensed to prepare a body for a funeral. They are not a medical provider in any form or fashion. They do not necessarily have to go to med school or have biology backgrounds, but they have to be trained as a mortician in how to handle, say, infectious body fluids and that kind of thing as it relates to a dead body. A medical examiner is a person who is an actual physician or doctor who has specialized training to do autopsies. A coroner is an elected official who may or may not have any medical background. Who do you think determines if an autopsy is going to be performed?
Probably the wrong one.
It depends on where you are. It depends on where you are. Coroners, and a lot of places around America, because they are small towns, they do not have a need for a medical examiner because the death rate is just so low, what they have is a coroner. A coroner is required to go out most of the time when there is an accident or suspected foul play and determine if it is worth sending the body to a medical examiner to have an autopsy in a different district. If you're in a larger area like Houston, a coroner is not usually one that decides that a medical examiner probably will be involved in that case if there is suspicion of foul play. But if you were, say, out in Luling, they may just have a coroner. If you're out in like Ziegenbach, Texas, it might just be a coroner. And again, these people are elected officials. A lot of times they are lawyers or just people with a lot of time on their hands. But they don't have to have any medical background whatsoever in order to get this role. So one thing to be aware of, autopsies are not standard in America. There are times when it is a requirement. And in these situations, you cannot say no if you are a family member. So if death is unexpected, unexplained, or it happens to a child, autopsies must be done. If the body is burnt, skeletonized, meaning it is so old it is turned into a skeleton, or if they cannot identify who it is, it must have an autopsy. If there are suspected misadventures such as electrocution, work injuries, or unwitnessed drownings or motor vehicle accidents, they will do an autopsy. If there is violence, foul play, malfeasance, suspect, and if they think somebody died of a drug or alcohol overdose, specifically because so many poisons look like that. But situations where you don't have to have an autopsy if the victim has a known medical condition and if their death appears to be related to that condition. So say somebody has a heart problem and they die of heart failure and it looks like heart failure, but it's been a poison, you won't necessarily have an autopsy because they knew what that person died of more than likely. And so a physician will just sign off on it. A coroner is not likely to go in and say, hey, the 70-year-old man who has a history of heart attacks died of another heart attack. They're not going to go do an autopsy necessarily. The death appears to be natural causes. There's medical indications of what this person died from. I listed this in here because you can have acute illness such as food poisoning, but not receive an autopsy. Or you can have an acute illness that is known that is still considered natural causes or related to an injury that you've sustained, but your course of, demise fits with that injury. So you can poison somebody because they're already teetering and maybe not have an autopsy. They have an adequate medical history to explain injuries that they sustained that were the presumed cause of death. So say somebody has a seizure and they fell down the stairs. If they have a long history of seizures, that may not be something that they decide to do an autopsy in, even though it is a violent death. Yes, Anna.
So Shan asked in the chat, what about necropsies? I'm thinking of someone poisoning a racehorse or some such.
So, the thing that happens, though, is you as an individual can pay for an autopsy. You can elect to have an autopsy or a necropsy, but you have to pay for it. And so if the person who is elected or who is in charge of the case for that death rules that a autopsy is not required, then the family members, the owner or whatever will have to pay for that autopsy, necropsy out of their own pocket. And that can be prohibitive because depending on what part of the country, and it is somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000. So the likelihood of it happening really depends on how much money you have. So for example, my father died. We know what he died of, but we did an autopsy anyway. My mom elected to do it. And we found out some interesting stuff about his health, but it didn't make the reason that he died really any more clear, if that makes sense. Okay, so why would they go ahead and do an autopsy if there was poisoning, but no certified signs of foul play? If somebody goes out to investigate a death or there is an evaluation and they go, this death was sudden, there's no medical history. This is a, really strong, vital 20-something-year-old woman. There's not really an indication why they would have died of this heart attack. We're going to go ahead and do an autopsy and see if there's an underlying condition that they don't, they didn't have any knowledge about for some reason. There's silent heart conditions that people have, or we're going to figure out why they died. Has the person who's been taking care of them been associated with other deaths? That's a big one because again, people who are in caregiving roles, whether licensed or not, have access usually to medications and they have access to that patient unfettered. And so they have the means, and the answer is, do they have the motivation? And if there is a pattern, then they start looking for that. Did the victim receive medical treatment for something, leave the hospital, leave medical care, but die later? Like get worse and die later. This is one of those things where if it's a slow poison and say, I'm at home, my husband is putting cyanide in not my coffee in very small doses, and I feel sick enough to go to the hospital. I'm in the hospital for a week, and during that time I get better because I'm no longer being poisoned. I go home, my symptoms get worse, or I suddenly die of those same symptoms. That's an indication, hey, this person is being exposed to something on a regular basis that is making them sick and has now killed them. Does that caregiver have access to restricted drugs or chemicals? Again, medical personnel usually do. For instance, if I am a nurse, which I am, and I'm going through a crash cart and I'm going through and trying to find the medicines that are expired, those medicines probably still work, but I cannot legally give them to somebody. But I can pocket those technically and walk away with them because they are not restricted, which means that I have epinephrine in my pocket now if I wanted to use it against somebody to kill them. Again, not something I've done, but something other nurse caregivers have done. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, atropine, they all work pretty much the same way to cause heart palpitations, increased heart rate, and then heart abnormalities. And so if I give that to somebody who doesn't have a heart problem, that could kill them, even though those drugs are used to save lives for people who are having heart problems at that time. And then, again, we're going to look at the caregiver stuff a lot. Was there a history, though, of infidelity of either the victim or the spouse? Because if you're getting ready to go and they won't let you, or they have something on you, and you feel the only way to get out is for them to be gone, it might lead you more towards poisoning or homicide. And then if this is a death of a child, have other children died? Because people who do murder tend to murder in the same way, and they may have an MO. Forensic toxicology is really cool. There have been a lot of things that have changed over the past 30 years that make it a lot easier to identify poisons. And it's one of the reasons why it's a lot harder to poison people. However, as I just stated, if you choose the right poison, a poison that person maybe is already taking in a normal dose, but you've accidentally overdosed them, or you have convoluted situations that they are in at home so that they die of something because you've given them, say, a food that they shouldn't have along with their medicines, or cause anaphylaxis for those who are allergic to certain things. There are a lot of ways poisons get missed, but once they are targeted, hey, I think this is a poisoning, forensic toxicology is actually really good compared, of course, to the 50s or the 30s or the 1800s. There are literally thousands of known poisons. Manufactured poisons exist now. You can create, wonder drugs inside of a lab and poisons inside of a lab that are novel, that don't exist in nature. And so those can still fall under the radar. Generally speaking, what will happen first is they will do an acid or base test, because you can sort of cut off like half of the different poisons that you know of based upon where it falls in pH balance. So for example, if somebody has taken too much aspirin, they will be able to do an acid-base test and say, hey, this is an acid, but they may not necessarily be able to say, hey, this was aspirin. Whereas if a person overdoses on amphetamines, I'm sorry, I wrote basis instead of bases. Amphetamines are bases. So if they do an acid-base test, they can tell that not necessarily that's an amphetamine, but that this was a base. Based on those results, the agent will usually be evaluated by a couple of different things. Thin litter chromatography basically is a visual assay that will break down the molecules inside of a sample to show you what those molecules are that are separate. A mass spectrometer actually determines the weight of molecules, and you can utilize the known weights of these different molecules to sort of say, okay, it's probably not this, it's probably not that, because these are the things that weigh this much from a molecular structure standpoint. And they will also do an immunoassay or antibody/antigen test to see if the victim's blood actually has antibodies or antigens related to the specific poison, because your body will have an immune response to your poison sometimes, depending on what the poison is. So if they can identify that antibody or antigen that is sort of communal to all humanity, they can go, okay, we may not necessarily tell you what the poison is, but we know your body reacted to it because it has that antigen or antibody. So they can figure it out that way. Some poisons will not show up in blood. They will build up in hair and fingernails and in soft tissue. So samples of the body will be taken and tested if poison is suspected, even if the blood is negative. All right.
One question. Can some poisons change your DNA to make it hard to identify the body if it's not obvious by inspection? See, like you got run over and left in a lake.
Sorry, say what, in a lake?
Sort of like like in case this body that I know of got ran over and then thrown into a lake for a couple of weeks?
It's highly likely, unless it actually just like a true acid, like if you dissolve a body in acid, yes, it can destroy DNA. But most poisons will not destroy DNA to the point that you're talking about. A lot of the poisons we talked about, like arsenic and some of the other ones, over long periods of time can cause cancer because it does have an impact on your DNA and it can alter the cells. And so that increases the risk for cancer, but not in the way that you're saying, we're like, all DNA is stripped and the body is not going to be recognizable because no DNA exists. So that's not something that would happen. However, if you're writing science fiction or you're writing fantasy, you're writing something that is otherworldly, you can make up whatever you want to, sir.
Sure.
So I found some fantasy books that really focus in on poison, that if you are interested in seeing how people have done this using poisons that don't exist in the real world or that exist only in these fantasy spaces. The Poison Wars by Sam Hawk is a really good one. Best Served Cold by Joe. So The Poison Wars is a series. Best Served Cold is one book. It's a standalone, but it's also part of a series by Joe Abercrombie. The Book of Ancestors series by Mark Lawrence, and Game of Thrones has Poisons Galore by George R.R. Martin. If you want a good poison that your reader will recognize, but you don't want them to get caught, and you are writing fiction, say you're making up your poison, you want to make sure that the poisons or the signs of poisoning shows up after death so that medical care cannot be provided. So, again, the cherry red blood, if that only shows up, say 2 weeks later with your novel poison, then you would not be able to necessarily provide an antidote for it. Create consistency in both the symptoms of the poison as well as the diseases that it possibly is mimicking. Make the poison take a long time from ingestion to symptomology or death. Like we talked about with cyanide, if you do acute cyanide poisoning, it happens within hours. So you take the number of people that person was exposed to over the course of hours, and it's probably going to be very small. Whereas like a poison that takes a couple of weeks, that person may have traveled countries. That person has come into contact with hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And so the number of possible suspects is going to be significantly greater if it takes a while from onset. Make it easy to obtain and create. If it comes from a common plant, if knowledge on how to use or make that poison is common, or it is just accessible in the environment, anyone can be the culprit. Make it untestable or find means to deny testing. For example, in our society, you can't refuse an autopsy for religious purposes, but if you are making a fantasy world and the process by which they are going to attempt to figure out if this person was poisoned will say denature the body from a religious standpoint, you can deny by religiosity. So find ways to make it so even if the person is suspected, they may not be able to be, pursued essentially for legitimate reasons, and make it something that the victim could already possibly come into contact with. Like I said, people who work in certain industries are always going to be exposed to higher levels of chemicals. If you put somebody into a higher level of exposure that causes actual damage or poisoning, but they were already going to have, that in their system, if they are tested for it, then it'll just look like an accidental exposure. Now,
can I braggadocio about a little one? I think I have most of the things on your last slide.
Okay.
I know you've already read this little story and stuff like that, but I have a assassin guy, and what he does is picks death cap mushrooms from a very specific spot where the ground is contaminated with heavy metals. And so the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning and the death cap mushroom are very similar. It doesn't happen right away. It takes a few days for the death cap to kind of start to make you sick. And it is similar to the heavy metals. So if they ever tested your blood, they say, oh, you have heavy metal poisoning, while ignoring the extremely rare mushroom that can do this. That was my little fun, hidden way. And I'm glad I got most of them. I do not make it something the victim already comes into contact with.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one of those things where, again, the caregivers who are accidentally giving you too much morphine because you're already terminal, or you accidentally took too much of your sleeping medicine because you did it, at 11 o'clock and then you were sleepy and a little bit off, and you did it again at 4 o'clock and you're a little sleepy and off. You did it at, 7 in the morning. Yeah, so there's different reasons for this for each of those, and you don't have to necessarily have all of them, but they do help. All right, so if you want to make a good poison, but have your culprit get caught, make the symptoms unique to poisoning. So for instance, the weird rashes that certain poisons cause may be telltale signs. If a person's skin changes color or the poisons build up in their nails and change their color, that can be a telltale sign. Allow the victim to be able to taste, smell, or otherwise note an aberration in their environment so that they are able to avoid a fatal dose. Because if they're around to talk about it, they're more likely to find the culprit. Make the poisons transmissible in one form or fashion. Have those who touch or come in contact with the poisoned body also fall ill with the same symptoms because they have had secondary exposure to that poison. That way you have victims that are able to define what is wrong with them and how they had, how they had exposure to it, and then an investigation will get opened. Make the poison require uncommon knowledge, riches, or access in order to obtain. There's a lot of different mercuries that are used in industrial circumstances, but you have to work in those industries to get that mercury in order to poison somebody. So if you find somebody with mercury poisoning, more than likely it's the guy that can actually order mercury from work and walk home with it. Same thing inside of your fiction. If it is something that is unusual for your space or it costs a lot of money, that cuts down the number of suspects it can be. Again, make the poison fast acting because it cuts down the number of suspects that could prospectively give that medicine. And then use the real world as a means of giving yourself like ideas, because there's a lot of poisons and there's a lot of toxicology that is really interesting that you can use as a basis for your poison. Make the poisons unusual for the location or specific circumstances that your victim is in. For example, some poisons only grow, or the plants they come from only grow in certain climates. And so if you're poisoned with it, that's really unusual because it means somebody has traded that medicine or that poison and it has traveled to get to you. So these are ways of making it so that they're still interesting, but we'll get the culprit caught. These are key things. Consistency is key for your poison. Your poison should have consistent symptoms. However, just be aware that if you're trying to be realistic, there's often variability of how fast something impacts people or how bad the symptoms are based upon their existing underlying conditions, how good their health is, how old they are, how much they weigh, and sometimes also gender. And again, remember, anything can be poison. Like we said, too much cinnamon can be poison. Too much of your warfarin, which you are already taking for a medical, situation, as a blood thinner, take too much of it, you are now poisoned. Your poisoner must be cunning and have nerves of steel. If nobody poisons on a whim, unless they have psychological issues, more than likely this is really well planned. If you want to get them caught, a lot of the things that we saw with people who were convicted of poisoning is that they had really, really strong hubris. They thought they were too good for anybody to realize what they were doing. Go wild, include venom, include toxins, include poisons that can be administered in unusual ways, like between the toenails and crap. Like go crazy. That's really interesting and fun. And then if you're trying to mirror an actual poison that exists in the world, ask a professional in order to add realism to your story. There are times where you may have a misconception about a medication because it is common knowledge, but that common knowledge is wrong. And enough people know about it now that it takes them out of the story or it makes it seem unrealistic. There are people out there that work in toxicology, that work in medicine, pharmacists that can help you out. Go looking, buy them a cup of coffee. Sean can go into a deep dive on how to get people to talk to you if they're professionals. But it's better to say, hey, I'm trying to write about this. I would love it if you would sit down and talk to me about my book. I will buy you a coffee. Can I have an hour of your time? And them say, no, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. And you go on to the next. Then you make a big mistake that makes your book less fun for the reader. All right. Are there any questions?
This was really great, Shannon.
Yay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. This is cool.
Yeah, it's a great unusual topic that we have probably all had concerns about and worries about. We wondered how to do it right.
I like Shan's question. I wonder how many people have been murdered via salmonella. This is the kind of thing where it's like they can't prove that this person was intentionally poisoned. And that's why the number of poisons that are confirmed versus what they think might be out there is 1 out of 30, 1 out of 40, because there's all sorts of things where accidental stuff happens. That's not considered a homicide and not actually investigated, where it could have been intentional.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, guys, it is after 2. So I want, if Ian is still around, to pop back up for those who came late and let us know what we're doing next week. I will get that event up this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Give us a little recap of what we're working on next week, bud.
Yeah, so next week we're going to be talking about video game writing, cool narratives in video games, and how it gets done.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, if there are no questions, I will let you all go on with your day. Look forward to seeing you later. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Shannon. Bye.
Thank you, Shannon.